August 12th, 1853. The state of Rhode Island. Two trains are racing toward each other on the same track. The conductor of the first train looks at his watch. 2 minutes left before the siding time. The conductor of the second train looks at his. The time has already passed. The track is clear. Both watches were working fine. They just showed different times. In a few seconds, 14 people will die. But this wasn't humanity's first encounter with this problem, and the effort to solve it began nowhere near America, but on a small island in Europe, 13 years earlier. It's hard to imagine, but just 200 years ago, people had no unified time at all. Every town decided for itself what time it was. The sun at its peak meant noon. It didn't matter that the next town over still had a few minutes left until noon. The first mechanical clocks appeared in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, in monasteries, where monks needed to know exactly when to call the others to prayer. By the 15th century, clocks appeared on the town halls of major cities. But these were public clocks, one for the whole town, striking the hour with a bell. Personal pocket watches remained a luxury for a long time. By the 19th century, thanks to industrial manufacturing, they began to spread among ordinary people. The problem wasn't that clocks didn't exist. The problem was that they showed different times in different places. The first steam locomotives appeared in England in the early 19th century. On single-track lines, where oncoming trains had to pass each other at a precisely calculated moment, a difference in time turned into a risk of collision. The Great Western Railway was the first to give in. In the early 1840s, it announced, from that moment on, all its stations and timetables would run on a single time, the one shown by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London. Towns resisted. For centuries, people had simply lived by the sun. It rose, it set, and that was enough. Now they were being forced to adopt the time of a foreign city, needed not for their own lives, but for someone else's trains. In Exeter, Oxford, and Bristol, people simply refused to go along with it. But the trains kept running on London time, while town life kept running on local time. To avoid confusion, clockmakers started building clocks with 2-minute hands, one showing local time, the other railway time. For anyone who trusted only the local hand, the train wouldn't wait. People simply missed their ride. Greenwich time only became official law in 1880, 40 years after the first company switched its station clocks. Outside Britain, every country had its own time. Dozens of nations, even more railway companies, and no one could force anyone else to agree. Across the ocean, the very same problem, but on the scale of an entire continent, would turn into a far bloodier story. In the United States, railroads crossed an entire continent, which meant dozens of different local times all at once. And it was here, 13 years after Britain's solution, that history repeated itself, but with a far more terrible ending. Let's go back to those two trains we started with. August 12th, 1853, the state of Rhode Island. A young conductor, only recently promoted from brakeman to this position, checked his watch before departure. It wasn't an official watch. He'd borrowed it from a milkman. Nobody had checked it, nobody had calibrated it. By the time he reached the siding, his watch told him there was still enough time. The oncoming train's watch told a different story. There wasn't. The discrepancy was just 2 minutes. 14 dead, 17 injured. This single accident in 1853 was one of 11 major incidents on American railroads that year that together killed more than 100 people. But people didn't immediately draw the right conclusion. They blamed the conductor, his inexperience. A few companies started buying quality watches afterward and checking them regularly. That solved part of the problem, but not the main one. The main problem remained. Even properly working watches showed different times in different towns. And in 1891, in the town of Kipton, Ohio, a new disaster struck. According to the common version of events, this time the engineer's watch had stopped for a few minutes, then started again, and he never noticed. A mail express train collided at full speed with another train that, according to the engineer's watch, simply shouldn't have been there. 9 people died. It finally became clear. The issue wasn't the quality of the watches. The issue was the very idea that every town could have its own time. Sandford Fleming was born in Scotland in 1827. He later moved to Canada and built railways there, and he too had a similar experience, though, fortunately, without any casualties. In Ireland, he misread a train timetable. The printed schedule said P.M., and he apparently read it as A.M., or the other way around. Accounts differ. The exact mix-up doesn't matter. What matters is that he spent the night at an empty station, waiting for a train that had already left long ago. Most people in that situation would just get angry and catch the next one. Fleming wrote a manifesto. It was called Terrestrial Time. In it, he proposed 24 unified time zones for the entire planet, one for each hour of the day, each about 15 degrees of longitude wide. The idea was so simple that it seems obvious today, but in 1876, when Fleming first presented it, it sounded almost like the eccentric notion of an engineer who'd been a little too upset about missing a train. Fleming wasn't the first to notice the problem. In the U.S., a similar idea had already been promoted back in 1869 by Charles Dowd, a schoolteacher from Connecticut. He proposed dividing the country into 4 zones. For more than 10 years, he traveled to railroad companies and spoke before Congress, and almost no one wanted to listen to him. Fleming sent his manifesto to influential scientists around the world. An American meteorologist, Cleveland Abbey, independently pushed for a similar idea. He needed standard time to synchronize weather forecasts across the country. Together, their voices carried more weight and gradually won over scientists and politicians. By 1883, American railroads were in real chaos. Roughly 50 different official timetables were in use across the continent at once. Picture a station where several clocks hang on the same wall, each showing the correct time for its own railroad company. On November 18, 1883, at noon, on a telegraph signal from the observatory, station masters across the U.S. and Canada simultaneously reset the hands of their station clocks to a new, agreed-upon time. Dozens of different local times disappeared in a single minute. But this was a solution for one continent. The question remained: how do you get the entire globe to agree? In October 1884, representatives of 25 countries gathered in Washington for a conference called the International Meridian Conference. It was convened to settle the main question: how to make a single standard time mandatory for every nation on Earth. Fleming was one of the key figures there, but the other delegates declared that this fell entirely outside the conference's authority, and the proposal was never even put to a vote. Instead, they decided something else: where to draw the prime meridian, the reference point for longitude and time across the entire planet. And that's where the real fight began. Britain proposed its own Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Logically enough, since more than 2/3 of the world's shipping already used British nautical charts. France resisted to the very end. It had its own tradition of measuring from the Paris meridian, and it didn't want to hand symbolic primacy to its rival. According to one version of events, before the vote, France tried to get Britain and the U.S. to adopt the metric system in exchange for agreeing to the meridian. That didn't happen, and in the end, France chose not to vote against it, but simply to abstain. Greenwich became the world's prime meridian. By the way, This is exactly what explains a strange detail anyone notices the moment they look at international time zones. Today's world time isn't called Greenwich time, even though that's exactly where it all started. It's called Coordinated Universal Time, UTC. And that abbreviation makes no sense in either English or French. In English, Coordinated Universal Time would logically be abbreviated CUT. In French, Temps universel coordonné would be TUC. When international organizations were finalizing this standard in the early 1970s, the English-speaking and French-speaking sides simply couldn't agree on whose abbreviation should win. The solution turned out to be a genuinely diplomatic one. They picked a third option that belonged to neither language, UTC, an abbreviation invented specifically so as not to offend anyone. That same compromise between London and Paris, which began back in 1884 with the argument over the meridian, was still echoing a century later in the three letters that now appear before every time offset on your phone. And here's the real point. Every country in the world still counts its time from that exact spot in Greenwich, chosen at the 1884 conference. Whatever time zone you're in, it's always an offset, plus or minus, from that same prime meridian in a London suburb. The dispute between Britain and France ended not even with a victory, but with the entire globe, without exception, accepting a reference point invented in one city. The Washington Conference's decision didn't automatically turn into law. Most countries kept living on local time for years afterward, in some places for decades. In the U.S., a formal federal law on time zones only appeared in 1918. 34 years after, the railroads had already divided the country into 4 zones de facto. The government simply recognized what business had already done on its own. Japan switched to a unified time standard in 1888. India did so much later, and in a rather unusual way. It first set its time by the observatory in Madras, because that observatory was technically able to transmit the precise time signal by telegraph to the rest of the country. Some regions still live with offsets that don't divide evenly into a full hour. In India or Iran, for example, the difference is half an hour. That's not an error or a coincidence. It's an echo of those very decades when every country bent the global system to its own local habits instead of the other way around. Next time, a plane lands in another country and the watch on your wrist automatically jumps forward or back by a few hours, remember that this was once simply impossible, and that someone, quite literally, paid for it with their life.